Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Easy Chat English Podcast. I'm Amelia, your host, and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Ethan. Today, we're going to talk about something that we all use but might not think much about: transportation. Specifically, transportation in the United States from our personal experiences. Hi, Ethan. How are you doing today?
Hey, Amelia. I'm doing great. I'm really excited to talk about transportation because it's such a big part of life here in the U.S., especially since moving around can be so different from one part of the country to another. I have a funny story about my first experience with the subway in New York that I can't wait to share.
Awesome. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will relate to that. So, let's get started. In this episode, we're going to dive into everything from car culture to public transportation, some of the challenges we face when traveling, and even what the future of transportation might look like. By the end, we hope you'll pick up some useful words and expressions to help you talk about transportation in English. Let's kick things off with car culture in the US. If you live in America, having a car is almost a necessity, especially if you don't live in a big city. I remember when I first moved to a suburban area, it felt like I couldn't go anywhere without a car. There's no public transportation like buses or trains, so having a car made life much easier.
Totally. That's such a good point. I think for people from other countries, it can be surprising just how dependent Americans are on cars. You'll often hear people talking about their daily commute, which means the trip from home to work and back. Most people drive their own cars for this.
Yes, and it's not just about getting to work. You take your car everywhere, to the grocery store, to visit family, or even on a road trip. Speaking of road trips, have you ever gone on one?
Oh yes, my family used to take road trips every summer. We'd pack the car, stop at gas stations along the way, and drive for hours. It's actually one of my favorite memories, hitting the road and just exploring different states. The freedom that comes with having a car is a huge part of American culture.
I love that, and it's so true. A lot of families in the U.S. spend time on the road. Plus, when you think of suburbs, these are areas outside of big cities. It's nearly impossible to get around without a car. That's why things like carpooling are so common. Do you remember when you first learned to drive?
Yes, I do. It was a huge milestone for me. I felt so grown up getting behind the wheel. In the US, getting your driver's license is kind of a rite of passage for teenagers. It gives you a lot of independence, and of course, you need to know where all the gas stations are for refueling.
Now, let's switch gears and talk about public transportation, which is a lot more common in big cities. When I lived in New York, I used the subway almost every day. It's such a fast and convenient way to get around the city. I didn't even think about getting a car.
I had a similar experience. My first time using the subway in New York was, well, let's just say it was an adventure. I was visiting for the weekend, and I got completely lost on the subway. I missed my stop and ended up on the other side of the city. It was pretty stressful, but I learned to catch the train quickly after that.
Yes. Catching the train during rush hour can definitely be a challenge. That's when everyone is trying to get home after work, and the trains get really crowded.
Exactly. And the thing about public transportation is that it's so different depending on where you are. In cities like New York and Chicago, the subway and buses are really popular. But in smaller cities or towns, people mostly rely on buses, or they drive their own cars.
Yes, and when it comes to public transportation, knowing how to navigate things like fare cards and bus schedules is important. It's all part of getting used to the transportation system.
Even though transportation in the US has its conveniences, it also has its challenges. For one, traffic can be a nightmare in many places. I've been stuck in a traffic jam on more than one occasion. It's frustrating when you're just sitting there in bumper-to-bumper traffic and not moving.
Tell me about it. In some cities, it feels like you spend more time sitting in traffic than actually driving. And then there's the problem of finding a parking spot, especially in busy areas. It's like a daily struggle.
Yes, and if you're running late, it can feel even worse. I remember one time I was late to an appointment because I couldn't find parking anywhere. The worst part is when you're in a hurry and you're driving around looking for a spot.
Exactly. And speaking of frustration, have you ever seen people get road rage? It's pretty common in big cities where traffic and stress levels are high. People can get really angry behind the wheel.
Oh, definitely. I've seen it happen a few times, and it's not pretty. People honking their horns, shouting out of their windows, or even cutting other drivers off. It's a real problem, especially when you're stuck in traffic for a long time. It's like all that stress just builds up, and some people can't control their temper.
Yeah, it's almost like driving becomes a race. Some people just can't handle the waiting, and that's when things get heated. I've seen drivers tailgating. That's when someone drives way too close behind you, or even speeding up to beat red lights. It's dangerous, not just for them, but for everyone else on the road.
So true. And if you ever find yourself feeling that road rage building up, just take a deep breath, put on some relaxing music, and remind yourself that getting there safely is the most important thing.
Now, if you want to avoid all those driving headaches, there are other ways to get around. Ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft have become really popular. I use them all the time, especially when I don't feel like driving.
Same here. They're super convenient, especially in cities where finding parking is difficult. You just book a ride and the car comes to you. It's also a great way to get around when you're visiting a new city and don't have a car.
And speaking of getting around without a car, a lot of people are starting to use bike-sharing services, especially in eco-friendly cities. I've used them a couple of times myself. You just pick up a bike from a bike station and drop it off at another one. It's really simple.
Yes, I've tried that too. It's nice to have alternatives like bikes or even scooters. And if you need a car for a short time, you can always rent one. There are car rental services that make it easy to get a car for a weekend or a road trip. Looking to the future, transportation is changing a lot, especially with the rise of electric vehicles or EVs. Have you ever driven an electric car?
I actually have. It was a rental car, and it was so quiet compared to a normal car. Plus, you don't need to stop at gas stations anymore. You just go to a charging station to power up.
That's amazing. I haven't driven one yet, but I've been thinking about getting an electric car because they're so much better for the environment. There's also talk about self-driving cars, but I'm not sure how I feel about that. What do you think?
I'm a little cautious about it too. The idea of sitting in a car without driving feels strange, but it's probably going to become more common in the future. With all these new technologies, the way we get around is definitely changing. Cities are also expanding their bike lanes and improving public transportation to reduce traffic. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode on transportation in the U.S. We've covered a lot, from car culture to public transportation, and even the future of transportation with electric and self-driving cars. Ethan, any final thoughts?
Just that transportation plays such a huge role in our daily lives, whether we're commuting to work, going on a road trip, or just getting around town. I hope our listeners picked up some useful vocabulary today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Be sure to share your own transportation stories with us, whether it's about driving, taking the bus, or trying out ride-sharing apps. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. See you next time.
Bye for now and safe travels.